The following is the second of 5 videos criticizing the games in the Super Smash Bros. Series. I have already completed my Smash 64 video and plan to use concepts that I introduced previously, so I suggest that you start from the beginning of the series. The goal of these videos is to examine the decisions lead developer Masahiro Sakurai made, to speculate on the intent behind them, and to explore the results. This video in particular is meant to document an uncharacteristic shift in Sakurai's design goals, as well as discuss the finer points on what makes a good competitive game. This video is meant for people who have played the game beforehand, and the content will reflect that, so please do so before continuing if you haven't already. Upon the success of Smash 64, Nintendo commissioned Sakurai to create a sequel to coincide with the release of the considerably more powerful Nintendo Gamecube. Since Super Smash Bros. Was released very late in Nintendo 64's lifespan, Sakurai had to start working on Melee less than 2 years after the release of Smash 64. The original might be called a surprise overnight success, and so there was a lot of pressure on Sakurai to outdo his previous work. The development of Melee lasted about 13 months, and was built for an entirely new engine. Despite the very short development cycle, the character roster is more than double, the stage list over triple, and there are many extra game modes and items. Excitement was high for this title as one of the staple games of the launch of the GameCube. There are many signs that Sakurai was compromising in order to complete a game of this ambition in such a short amount of time. The character roster is much bigger, jumping from a cast of 12 to a cast of 25, or 26 if you count Zelda and Sheik as 2 different characters. But if you look closely, the increase in character count is partially illusory. One of the ways the cast is increased is through the use of clone characters, which have the same attacks and animations as the original. Nearly half of the original cast has a clone added in, and that's if you don't count Mario and Luigi as clones themselves, which I think is pretty fair to say, as Luigi has been largely decloned since Smash 64. In order to derive how many unique characters are added to Melee, you take the whole roster, remove the 12 that were in 64, and any clones. This just leaves 8 characters, which seems a lot less impressive than the 14 new icons on the character select screen. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against clones, and when properly implemented, they can add a significant amount of content to a game for an order of magnitude less work. The purpose is just to show ways the game was more rushed than originally it seemed to be. Originally, Marth and Roy were going to be characters exclusive to the Japanese release of the game, but American interest in these new characters was cited as the reason why this idea was abandoned. Plus, it would be a shame to waste the work on these characters, especially since both of them became instantly popular upon release. Once again, there were characters planned that never came to fruition, 2 of which, Snake and Sonic, were offers from other developers to have their character put in the game. Both of these offers were made way too late in the development cycle, but they also made it into the sequel anyways. The fact that these offers were made in the first place was a very good sign that Melee was going to be a hit, as it turned the heads of developers who had nothing to do with Nintendo games in the first place. Sakurai went all out trying to come up with odd and creative movesets to the characters that were added to the game. Not to mention every previous character needed a new attack added, as a new special attack was added to the control scheme. Outside of clones, the new characters did an excellent job of differentiating themselves in almost every way. Mr. Game & Watch was an interesting choice due to very few players knowing who he was, but his unique style won many of those skeptical over very quickly. His attacks were slow and powerful, and as a counterbalance he died very quickly. His animations were quirky and composed entirely of keyframes without the transitions. He also had a lot of oddball abilities like a hammer that had different effects based upon what random number appears above it. Idiosyncratic design like this added a lot of personality to the game, especially when the goal was to capture the personalities of as many diverse playstyles and tastes as possible in the characters. As for Zelda and Sheik, I am, ironically, split about the idea. On one hand, I think that for one to switch to the other makes perfect sense given the character, and from a gameplay perspective I think Sakurai wanted the player to rack up damage with Sheik's fast, punishing moves, and then switch to Zelda for her slow, powerful finishers. If Sheik perhaps didn't have much of a way to kill easily, and Zelda was good at landing those kill moves but bad at racking up damage, then this might have been a good idea. However, the problem with this concept is that Sheik is objectively better than Zelda for any but the most basic player spamming forward smash. She's faster, her attacks are much easier to land with much less risk, and there are some quite easy setups into kill options. Personally, I think if you're going to have a concept like this, you have to improve the way the two forms work together, and then lower the risk of switching between them, though the slowness of the transition between them might just be an engine limitation. Peach has a lot going for her. She's pretty heavy and very floaty, which is a great combination. A lot of people don't understand the difference between weight and fall speed, so what I said may make very little sense to them. Character weight determines how much knockback you take after a hit, as well as the speed of throws and the amount of time after a throw where the character is actionable. Weight does not affect how fast you fall, however, that is fall speed. You can have a slow fall speed, often called being floaty, or a fast fall speed, which determines the effect of gravity in two ways: top speed and acceleration. For example, Samus is very heavy, but also very floaty. Bowser is obviously very heavy as well, but his fall speed is right in the middle. Conversely, Fox and Falco are both fast fallers with relatively light weight. Captain Falcon is heavy and a fast faller, so he dies very slowly, which is in theory balanced out by his poor recovery options. Jigglypuff is both very light and very floaty. The acceleration of your fall speed is also important. If you jump horizontally as Fox, you'll very quickly be pulled to the ground, because his acceleration is very high. Captain Falcon has a very similar top fall speed, but his acceleration is much slower, which is why his leap is like a majestic gazelle. There are even a few situations where, despite Fox being much lighter than Falcon, Captain Falcon dies earlier due to his low acceleration. But anyways, back to Peach. She's both hard to combo due to her floatiness, and hard to kill due to her weight. She has a float ability where she can hover in the air for a few seconds. She can pull out a turnip to annoy players trying to get back on stage, and most of her moves have an insane amount of kill power, besides her side special, which for some reason is slow like a Falcon Punch, but has virtually no kill power. I have a theory that Sakurai was trying to make a character for girls to pick up the game and play with, and that he expected them to not be any good, so he made the character both strong and very easy to use at a low level. She has a very powerful and spammable move with her down smash, and slow, easy to use recovery, both things useful for someone who doesn't play a lot of games. This is all speculation of course, but it's a hunch based upon the assumption that at the very least, Sakurai kept the audience of a character in mind when designing it. Bowser showcases what happens when you go too far in designing for free-for-all. If I were to come up with 5 basic attributes that define how good a character is on the most basic level, I might say speed, range, survivability, power, and safety. Bowser is the only character in the game that has virtually none of these things, and for this reason is not only one of the worst characters in the game but also quite unpopular among most audiences. Speed refers to movement, and Bowser is bottom 3 in the game as far as dash. In the air he is a mid-level as far as floatiness as well, which doesn't couple well with his lack of momentum. For such a big character, his range is quite low, and is exacerbated by his lack of speed. Survivability counts for multiple factors. His weight does help him survive strong attacks, but coupled with his size makes him combo food, and his recovery is very limited as well. His power is deceptively low compared to other characters you'd expect to be much weaker. His attacks are also very laggy in ratio to the amount of kill power, and his only saving grace is his up B out of shield, which is a decent get off me move. I don't plan to criticize all the characters this way, but instead I want to showcase an element of Sakurai's design philosophy. Since you'll be expected to play free-for-all most of the time, Sakurai feared any character with a lot of power, since with 3 other people on stage it's very likely you can throw out random moves and kill players very early, increasing your chance to get the points to win before the timer runs out. Sakurai wanted to decrease frustration as much as possible, and so he made sure that Bowser's forward smash wasn't much better than average, and then made sure that the character had a lot of other negative attributes to make up for it. Not only did this make him useful for only one thing in free-for-all and therefore not very fun, but it made him useless in 1v1, which is always a risk. As stated many times by Sakurai himself, Smash is a game meant to be played however you want it to. Balancing for all possible formats is nearly impossible of course, but in this case I'm not so sure the trade-offs were worth it. He isn't particularly fun to use in free-for-all, and he's useless in 1v1 because of all the restrictions put on him. Ganondorf is an example of a much better balance. He's very fun and popular in 1v1. He has slow, laggy special moves that have a lot of power, and strong but much more useful normals that are good for 1v1 play. The last new character I want to discuss is in my mind the most interesting character concept Sakurai has ever had. The first time I played Melee back when it had just released, I was instantly enamored with the concept of the Ice Climbers. I was convinced from day one that they would be the best characters in the game, if utilized by a person brilliant enough to desynchronize their movements enough to set up complicated traps and cover multiple options simultaneously. While I later found out that if it is a reality, it is most likely above human levels of abilities, I still find them to be a fascinating character concept. The way they work is you control only one of the ice climbers. The second one, if near you, will mimic your inputs with a delay of 1/10 of a second, or 6 frames. If far away from you, the second climber will do what they can to get to you, and will be controlled by an artificial intelligence. The reason I was so fascinated by the character concept was the idea of desyncing, which I had never taken the time to fully investigate. If I throw an attack out and before the animation is fully finished input a new attack, nothing will happen. You have to wait until after your move is finished before your character will accept another command. Ice climbers are unique however because there are 2 characters who accept inputs at different timings, and therefore will be using moves at different timings. If I decide to press an input while only one of my characters is able to accept it, then my characters become desynced. and I can continue to command the ice climbers while the other climber is busy doing something else. This is another character that is a little too weird to be all that popular, but the idea of having 2 weak characters instead of 1 normal character is my kind of weird, and so I'm happy they're in the game. These are just a few examples of all the creativity that was poured into the game despite its short development cycle. Despite all their hard work, the game clearly didn't have enough time to be properly balanced and bug tested, and you can see that in a few ways. One example is that you can mash out of Kirby's throws. This was apparently intentional in order to stop casual players from winning every match by hanging by the ledge, but there doesn't seem to be much of a point in having the ability if you're going to make it so easy to counter. Not to mention it makes most of Kirby's throws completely useless outside of that suicide option. Yoshi's grab enters the background and completely miss the opponent. All of Roy's attacks are hilariously weak compared to Marth's, and his dash attack hitbox is clearly unfinished. Missing hitboxes and hitboxes that don't belong also abound. I understand that Roy is supposed to be inverted Marth, and so his strength comes from the hilt, but there's pretty much no reason to choose him over Marth, since his only real advantages are his B attacks, which aren't that useful for anything other than hoping an opponent walks into them. Mr. Game & Watch's shield is significantly smaller than everyone else's, and 3 of his aerials cannot be L-cancelled despite the rest of the cast not having this problem. More on L-cancelling later. With that said, there is an insane amount of detail put into the game to balance out the quirks. Characters' clothes and hair move naturally based upon the context of the stage. Link and Young Link have functional shields now, and their hookshots function like they do in their game. Character movesets are packed to the brim with hidden properties. Marth's Dancing Blade and Roy's Double-Edged Dance function as recovery moves. The same can be said for Luigi's Cyclone, but only if it's charged on the stage first. Pichu hurts itself with its own attacks for some reason, making it both a clone of a way more interesting character, and a terrible joke character that no one would ever want to play as at the same time. Many attacks have tons of hidden properties and abilities in hitboxes, giving each move multiple different uses based upon your timings and spacing. Ness's baseball bat, for example, does far more knockback at the tip, which is great because it fits the properties of an actual swing of a baseball bat. The stage count increased dramatically in between titles, from 9 to 29. Not only are the stages themselves more numerous, but they are much larger, more complicated, and often much more chaotic. There's also a stage for every franchise featured by a character in the game, besides Fire Emblem, which was planned, but cut. The stages in Melee are some of the director's best work. They usually strike a good variety of level of balance, simplicity, size, and how much the gimmick at the level interferes with playing against each other. Sakurai with some stages embraces the platforming aspect of the game, and lets the stages move around. These stages are filled with variants and tend to remain fun only for a short while at a time, before dying due to your platform disappearing from under your feet becomes a bit cumbersome. Items can now be toggled on or off from the start, and so there are now more ways to play the game than ever. Having the stages themselves offer different variants in the gameplay is a great decision overall, though an argument can be made that if you want to play the game a very specific way, you have very few stages to choose from. For example, Hyrule Temple is a fan favorite due to how incredibly large it is compared to the rest of the stages, but the second largest is Fourside, which doesn't offer a similar experience at all. This isn't completely a bad thing, it's good that the variety is there, but the flaw of having playstyles influenced by stages is if you don't like a specific playstyle, you are going to have one less stage than someone who does. In all my years playing, I've never really wanted to play on Pokefloats, Rainbow Cruise, nor Big Blue, because I don't really enjoy fighting the stage while I'm fighting the opponents. A person who only likes these things, however, will only have the 3 to play over and over. As I said, this isn't exactly a flaw, but I can't help but wonder if it could have been possible to make as many stages as possible wild, and then have static variants instead. I understand how resource heavy this decision would have been, but it seems to me the only solution to the problem, and I can see why people would be happy to have less stages, but with more customization to those that were there. With that said, Sakurai clearly didn't find these more static stages as interesting, judging by the fact that he made the simplest stages, Battlefield and Final Destination, some of the last stages you can unlock. They weren't unlockable at all in the previous title. The single-player features were expanded upon more than anything else in the game. Classic mode now has a random selection of opponents, though the challenges are always in the same order. The most notable issue with Classic mode is a problem with all of the single-player modes. No C-stick functionality. In Melee, you are playing on a new controller for the Gamecube, and its largest change is the addition of a second stick to fight with. It can be used to input aerials, smash attacks, roll, jump, let go of the ledge, SDI, and so on. Its usefulness is practically limitless in multiplayer modes. But unfortunately in single player, the right stick controls the camera, which is completely useless in comparison. I understand that Sakurai was very proud of his dynamic camera, but the fact that there was no option to allow for the C-stick to work like versus mode is the most frustrating part of coming back to this game. This could have all been avoided if Sakurai wasn't always so dead set on the experience he wants the player to have, despite his claim that he wants the players to make their own decisions. The most obvious decision would be to let the players set their own control schemes. I don't get the feeling like Sakurai trusted the player as much as he said he did, and the story mode replay value is severely hampered due to this oversight. Either way, the other additions for classic mode are a new credits sequence that is luckily essentially skippable, Crazy Hand as a hidden enemy, and a new and improved race to the finish. I'm really glad that they improved race to the finish, now finishing all the way is a real challenge with most characters, but other than that I don't really have anything to say about classic mode, so let us just move on to adventure mode. Adventure mode is a real treat. There's something a little surreal about playing your favorite character in all these iconic settings, but they are well designed, albeit maybe a little simple. Having little secrets, like the big Kirby that shows up if you defeat the lesser Kirbys in 30 seconds or less, and Luigi appearing instead of Mario if you beat the previous level with the number 2 in the second place, adds that sort of Sakurai flair. Maybe some debate could have been made that the effort could have been put elsewhere, but honestly, this is an excellent way to up the ante for a sequel, and I'm not sure I'd have preferred a few extra stages or more time spent on game balance, when it's possible that it was an entirely separate sub-team who worked on the assets for single player anyway. Even if it wasn't, with a lot of the stages just being glorified match variants, I doubt adventure mode took much time to make, especially compared to creating characters, which is famously time consuming. Event mode can be quite enjoyable as well. I like how unlocking more characters also unlocks more events, and conversely, characters and stages are unlockable through events and the other single player modes. These modes do suffer from a pretty big flaw however, and that is how poor the artificial intelligence remains. While it is a step up from 64's AI in many ways, still you have enemies reading inputs and jab blocking you, as well as inexplicably being programmed to only recognize one option for a recovery when most of the cast has at least 2. The rest of the non-versus development was put into minor modes like Home Run Contest, All-Star Mode, Wireframe Battles, Trophies, various item additions, the new Break the Targets missions, and what may just be the greatest opening cinematic in video game history. The animation work is a huge improvement over the previous title. While Smash 64 was a 60 frames per second game, limited budget and time and maybe even memory limitations made it so there was a lot of animation reuse. In Melee, clone characters reuse animations, but outside of that the amount of unique and well-crafted animations is insane. Attacks have telegraphed startup, strong keyframes, and an appropriate amount of particle effects, and hit lag to sell the power of the moves. There's a real weight and power to the attacks, and this is not just due to the animations themselves, but also due to the fall, aerial, and run speed of the game, as well as the momentum preservation. These factors put together make things like this possible. Momentum preservation is often the key to making movement in any game feel really good, and when you couple that with intense speed, it can really increase how satisfying a single jump can feel. Not only is it more intuitive, but it creates a much more natural flow to your movement. Along with 2 3D Mario games, Melee is the only game that I find myself booting up just to move around. Similarly, it's very common to see players even at the top level play other Melee modes absently while they talk to their chat during streams, and the speedrunning scene for the game is possibly the most active of any fighting game to date. GameSpot at one point actually went so far as to call the game too responsive, where they felt that the sensitivity of the inputs made it too hard to move around with precision as a beginner. There is some merit to this criticism. The control stick is insanely sensitive to all the myriad of accidental and intentional movement options at your fingertips, and the most delicate of movements can make your character perform an action that you never intended. For example, if you press forward hard on the stick in Melee, your character will start an animation called the dash animation. After this animation finishes, your character enters a loop called the run animation. If you press back on the stick before the dash animation transitions to the run animation, you will reverse the direction of your dash. If you wait too long, however, and your character enters a run, you are committed to that run, and inputting back makes you skid to a stop before turning around and running the opposite direction. To a beginner, this would make movement feel janky and inconsistent. This sort of discomfort would likely extend to the lack of input buffer in the game as well. In Street Fighter V, if you press attack, and then you want to command your next attack, you could press the next attack up to 8 frames before your first attack animation finishes. In Melee, however, if you press jump even a single frame before your animation for your attack finishes, nothing happens. Beginners once again might take exception to this, because to them it would feel like the game is consistently eating their inputs, And even if they figured out what was going on, they likely might feel cheated. An input buffer can be thought of like a character's short-term memory. If I'm playing Sheik, and I forward tilted an enemy, and then I press the buttons to jump and forward air them, one might argue that me pressing the inputs is sort of similar to giving Sheik the idea to perform the action herself. If you look at it like that, it seems silly that the command was given and yet she disobeys because it was 1/10 of a second early. Despite how unforgiving this can be, the demand for precision can give players who take the time to learn the timings of their character's actions a level of fluidity in their actions as a reward. It's difficult to tell whether Sakurai's decision in these respects were an oversight, or if he really wanted players to learn their characters in a much more comprehensive way than ever before. But with all the little secrets each character has, it seems to me that he wanted the players to go digging. For example, Sakurai programmed into Fox and Falco one-frame windows where they can shorten their side Bs to different lengths. This clearly would only be learned by a player who spent hours with their character. I've been playing the game for years and I can't get it consistently at all. If Melee was a game designed solely for casual party play, I'm not sure why such inaccessible secrets would have ever been programmed in. It seems to me that he wanted to reward loyalty to one's character, and for players of many different types and levels of commitment to enjoy the game and to get something out of it. As the roster increased dramatically, the probability that a player could rely on a single, simple bread-and-butter combo to win as many games as possible also increased dramatically. He likely was already aware of things like Kirby up tilt in Smash 64, and wanted low-level players to have a chance to be able to escape from similar situations in the sequel. With this in mind, Sakurai designed the single most important game mechanic in Smash since the knockback percent system. Directional Influence is without a doubt the #1 reason why Melee is so engaging. With the increased speed of the characters in this game, it would be all too easy to combo to death the entire cast. Instead, Sakurai balanced this new mechanic so guaranteed combos are all but a myth in Melee. Now, whenever you're hit, the direction that you're holding the stick during hit stun alters the trajectory of your knockback. This way, a person can move an entirely different angle every time they're hit, and a player cannot anymore memorize a single combo that will work every single time against an opponent. To all but the most committed players, this distinguishes combos as a concept, and forces players to act on the fly, which in theory should give the one in the air time to double jump, air dodge, throw out an attack, or use whatever option that will help them escape their disadvantage. Since Melee has a lot more options at any one moment than the traditional fighter, it's actually a genius design decision to put more power in the hands of the person who just got hit, while still keeping them at a pretty serious disadvantage. If I was to guess, I'd say Sakurai assumed no one could ever consistently combo and win against players with this system, and so it evened the playing field far more. What he didn't realize is that in reality he just made the game a lot deeper, and people who learn how Directional Influence works can exploit that knowledge to widen the skill gap even further. Good players are much harder to come by since this makes the game far more difficult to master even if DI didn't exist. But Sakurai, by making the game deep and interesting competitively, and less repetitive casually, didn't do anything to stop competitive players from dominating casual players. I think this decision was honestly quite naive of Sakurai. He seems to believe when he designs a mechanic that other players aren't going to take the time to learn the ins and outs of how they work, and through this obscurity, Sakurai believes he'll have more control of the randomness of each match's outcome. Take L cancelling as an example. While no one knows for sure the reason it was put in the game, it definitely was on purpose, evidenced by Smash 64 having Z cancelling in the advanced techniques section of the Smash website, and there being a unique sped up animation if you successfully input the L cancel. But why was it put in the game? Did Sakurai just want to have that secret extra tech? The theory that resonates with me the most is that Sakurai first put it in his game to help out players who use an attack in the air and want to get to shield faster. As you press the shield button and hold it, your end lag is reduced and you can defend earlier. Sakurai likely didn't balance the game around everyone L-canceling every move into more aggression rather than defense, however, and so by trying to give more power to the defender, he actually just made aggression more potent than ever before, and many combos that wouldn't be possible before are now just an L press away. Competitive Melee is played with 4 stocks, singles or doubles, on Battlefield, Yoshi's Story, Dreamland, Fountain of Dreams, Final Destination, and Pokemon Stadium. Items are switched off in order to mitigate randomness, affecting the outcome of the match unnecessarily. The stages are chosen to be as unintrusive as possible, while still maintaining an acceptably diverse roster. I have often heard the phrase, "I don't play competitively, I just play for fun," which I think is a misunderstanding of the difference between casual and competitive fun. To take something seriously isn't the same thing as to not enjoy it, but it does at times take away the lighthearted, relaxed nature of the gameplay, while still remaining fun. In many ways, the difference between playing Melee casually and competitively is a bit like a first date versus a long-standing relationship. At first, the outcome does not matter because the investment was small, but as you get to know each other and see in depth what the relationship can be, you begin to see the person in a new light. And while you aren't able to go back to not knowing the person, you start to appreciate them on a new level that replaces the old. I think that people who have this mentality that to play competitively is to forsake fun are rejecting the vulnerability that comes with letting the matches matter to them. There are benefits of lackadaisical play, but there's something meritorious about giving your all in a game that you play, and while both ways are valid, I think people who put their time into playing it competitively deserve a similar respect that one would give any athlete. Another reason competitive Melee is criticized is the fact that in many different ways competitive Melee hardly resembles casual Melee. The stages chosen are generally the most sterile of the stages in order to eliminate matchup variance. For example, on Congo Jungle certain characters can safely stall with no counterplay. On stages where there are no ledges, there are inescapable combos on half the cast. In a way, it is a shame that competitive Melee doesn't have a way to use every stage competitively, but at the same time having 5 stages to choose from is still a major step up from Smash 64, and ultimately they do seem to provide a good amount of variety to the gameplay without the stages having an overbearing effect on which character will be more likely to win on each stage. There's still some effect of course. Jigglypuff wants a big stage in order to live longer since she's so light, and Marth wants Final Destination in order to juggle opponents without them being able to use a platform to escape. But overall, the stages chosen rely far more upon the skill of the player rather than the character they chose for that specific stage. Another aspect of the game that I'd say is by far the most intimidating part of competitive Melee is the gameplay itself, particularly the movement. One of the two most visually apparent things you notice are that players spend a lot of time awkwardly moving back and forth in a jerky fashion. This is called dash dancing, and it exploits the dash mechanics I discussed earlier. Having the characters move in such an unnatural way can be very jarring when the context of the game is lovable Nintendo characters that many people spent their childhood seeing act in a very specific way. The second movement option that people see is the most notorious and controversial aspect of Melee, which is at the same time probably the most misunderstood aspect of the game. I'm referring, of course, to wave dashing. In order to alleviate the problem with players getting juggled in Smash 64, Sakurai decided to add an air dodge to the game, which after use puts you in Special Fall, in which the only thing the player can do until landing or getting hit is drift one way or another. In order to add a little bit more power to the person air dodging, Sakurai also added the ability to air dodge in any direction, making it harder to catch a player coming down. It turns out, however, that if you decide to air dodge into the ground, some of your momentum is preserved. If you decide to air dodge diagonally intentionally before you have a chance to leave the ground, you get to slide a little to the left or right without being forced into the constraints of the running animation, which include that you cannot use smash attacks, jabs, and tilts while running. This is a pretty harmless option. You get no invincibility from the air dodge, you don't become overwhelmingly stronger in any way. Even if you take the time to learn it, knowing how to implement it in a useful manner can often take months. It just allows you to move in a new, but very limited way. The question everyone seems to have an opinion about is whether or not wave dashing is a glitch. Let's take a second to review all sides of that debate to come up with how justified competitive players are in defending wave dashing, and how justified casual players are in their purism. The first thing that has to be established is the definition for glitch. There are a few I found, though the simplest to address is a sudden, usually temporary malfunction or irregularity in equipment. This is software we're talking about, not equipment. But I think it's safe to say that this definition also applies to video game glitches. But in case you're unsure, I will include multiple definitions from other sources in the description that you're free to use instead. They will all apply to this discussion. So let us unpack the definition in relation to wave dashing. Is wave dashing a malfunction? Was it intended? Wave dashing combines multiple smaller mechanics that are all definitely working as intended. Momentum is preserved after air dodging. You can air dodge the same frame your feet leave the ground. Your friction variable decides how far your momentum will take you. Sakurai has reported that he did know about the slide that occurs when air dodging in the ground, and decided to keep it, very likely because he'd have to dismantle the core mechanics of air dodging in order to remove it, and he did not see the potential harm in a little slide. He definitely did not intend for it to be used the way that it is, however, and so while the parts are certainly working as intended, the whole of a wave dash and its purpose are definitely unintended. You cannot, however, call something a glitch because it's not how a developer wanted it used. Something has to break somewhere. People are exploiting the physics, but they aren't in any way doing something the physics wasn't built to be able to do. When you really get down to it, a video game is just an execution of written code. As far as the code is concerned, anything that happens is working as intended, insofar as it will only do what the code commands that it does. The intention of the developer is really the only barrier between what is a glitch and what isn't a glitch, and yet there are dozens of things a player can do that were not directly expected by the developer when the game was made, that are generally not called glitches. If in Mario 64 I'm supposed to climb Womp Fortress through the path designed by the developer, it still would not be a glitch if I decide to take an alternate route instead. In this way, the intention of the player begins to matter. The truth of the matter is the definition of glitch is to some extent subjective, since the intention of the developer changes, and what is considered working as intended and what isn't really is just defined by how much it bothers everyone, as much as it is the arduous journey of defining what is the core system and the exact parameters of its functionality ad nauseum. In the end, the owner of a game is the player as much as it is the developer, and the Melee community saw wave dashing and decided they wanted it to be part of the game that they called competitive Melee. Many other glitches were banned, called not part of the desired competitive experience, but the intention of the players and the community is what defined what is competitive Smash, not the intention of Sakurai. In Street Fighter, the ability to cancel hits into special attacks was unintended, a glitch even, but it's how players decided to play Street Fighter, and the developer allowed this accidental mechanic to stay in the game. In that way, if Sakurai decided that wave dashing was to be in all of his games, this conversation would have died long ago. Though I've never been a fan of death of the author arguments, I do have to admit that the author's intent does affect the game to some extent, and so while Sakurai had a game in mind when he created the flexible sandbox that is Super Smash Bros., many players decided they would use the tools given to them to create a game that looks altogether different. The same way a player who decided to use chess pieces to their own rules that they decided wouldn't be playing chess, it's very possible that the game being played in the competitive scene isn't Sakurai's Melee, but a new game created by the players. While the vast majority of characters in Melee are fun to play as and can win local tournaments with a bit of work, there are only 8 characters in Melee who are currently considered realistic choices for which to win a national level tournament. The top 8 are as follows: Fox, Falco, Marth, Jigglypuff, Peach, Sheik, Ice Climbers, Captain Falcon. All other characters are still used to varying degrees, but the people playing with them have rarely gotten very close to winning in the big leagues, and that is because their characters are either less flexible or less consistent than the top 8. The fact that the bulk of competitive Melee is played with less than a third of the cast sounds like a huge drawback, but the fact of the matter is less than 1% of Melee players ever make it into the top 8 of a major tournament, and so if your heart and soul is in playing as a non-top 8 character, there's no reason not to do it while you love it. And even if you want to be able to choose your character that will help you win, there's a huge amount of variety in playstyles even in the top 8, and since competitive Melee is to be viewed as its own separate game, it's unfair to compare it to the surface level variety of casual play. The viewing experience of competitive Melee has a bit of a curve to it. Newer players are often turned off by the lack of variety compared to other fighting games, and perhaps for good reason. People desire the victory of the underdog naturally, and anyone who wishes to see that underutilized character prevail are often very disappointed to find that Melee has less variance than any other esport I have ever seen. With that said, I think this may be just a new viewer's perspective, and once you start to learn the ins and outs of the game, the variety shows itself not in simple things like character selection, but in playstyle and unique interactions per capita. In top-level Melee, the most unique thing about it is how often there occurs something that no one has ever seen beforehand. In other fighting games, including Smash 64, combos are predetermined. They are something you practice in your room and then execute. In Melee, the bulk of practice and execution is for very specific follow-ups to very specific situations, because the chaotic nature of the game makes for the top player having to think on their feet and deal with a problem that they had never quite had to face in this exact way before. I don't want to sound like I'm bad-mouthing other fighting games when I say this. No two matches are exactly the same no matter what game you play, but the sheer amount of times a player views or plays a match and says to themselves,
I don't want to suck Melee's dick on a Melee stream, but Melee's beautiful because of things like that. Like, he's never done that combo in his life, I can almost guarantee it. Oh, I can almost guarantee he's never done that combo, but he might have.
Is staggering. Melee has an amazing quality in which it is always incredibly obvious who is playing due to the multiple ways every character can be played. 2 characters often considered the best are Fox and Falco. They have a lot of similar attacks, but in the end they play very differently, while sharing one aspect of the characters that is most notorious, if not downright iconic. Fox's Shine has fixed knockback, which means it ignores percent, and against characters heavy enough to not get knocked down by it, it combos into itself, since you can jump out of it, which means you can wave dash out of it, though SDI makes it a read rather than a reaction. It is frame 1 invincible and useful for edgeguarding, pressure, the relief of pressure, comboing, and looking really cool. Falco's Shine has knockback growth with percent, and is useful as a combo setup, which paired with his down air can make for some of the most elaborate punishes in the game. These 2 are the characters to beat no matter who you're playing as. They are the whole package: speed, aggression, and mix-ups. The 2 things they lack, however, is range and floatiness. They are both quite light and fall fast, which makes them combo food against anyone else in the game, and many of their attacks get outranged by the rest of the top 8, meaning they want to bait out whiffed defensive options and counterattacks before going in. Shine is debatably the best move in the game, but while the characters may be imbalanced in many ways, the reasons I listed stop the characters from being dominating to the point where the top players are only these two characters. There are many broken moves and characters in this series, but Shine is not so insurmountable as to get in the way of standard competitive gameplay. The thing I can say about these characters more than anything is it is very good that these two are the best. Every game is going to have a best, and they will be hated for being so, just by human nature. But Fox and Falco both make for very exciting matches no matter which of the characters you're playing, and it is likely if many of the other characters were the best, the metagame would ultimately be a lot less fun overall. In many ways, Marth is an excellent foil to these characters, being a sword user whose attacks are relatively slow and weak compared to the frame 1 aggression of Fox and Falco. His most interesting mechanic is the fact that his sword does different knockback angles and damage percents based upon what part of the sword you hit your opponent with. This makes combos very precise and interesting to watch. With the down air being by far one of the most satisfying finishers in the game, the character can be described as elegance incarnate. His problem is that he has a hard time closing out stocks, a phenomenon often called Marthritis. Marth is a character who understands the principle that landing hits is less about damaging the opponent, but more about limiting options and increasing disadvantage. The more percent you take, the more dangerous it is to influence your trajectory away from the opponent after getting hit, for example, as you're always at risk of DIing away a strong attack that will result in you not being able to get back on stage. On the other hand, sometimes throwing an attack is useful just to make a character feel threatened, rather than just attacking with the intent to hit. You can use this fear to also create positional advantage. Being nearer to center stage is preferable to being nearer to the edge because you are closer to the blast zone, and also being off stage, which is usually also a disadvantage in itself. Marth also is particularly good at juggling and keeping an opponent on platforms and incapable of getting down, which is another good way of keeping an opponent at a disadvantage. If I decided to be a professional competitive melee player, I very likely would play as Marth. Jigglypuff is the closest thing in the game to a complete character. She was very close to being terrible, but a few aspects of her moveset saved her. Firstly, she has a long disjointed back air that she can pair with her 6 jumps to try to keep pressure out. She uses her aerial mobility and floatiness to make it nearly impossible to get a reliable combo on her, and so despite how light she is, closing at the stock can be a challenge. She's a crouch that ducks under grabs, making it so opponents can't just wait for her to eventually land, run in, and grab. Finally, if you try to camp her out, she has a ridiculous comeback factor that was in the previous game but is now more powerful, called Rest. If Jigglypuff uses Rest above when she's about 50%, she's guaranteed to die, since a fully charged move on her is guaranteed to kill her. The lag is so long an opponent can die, respawn, and still land a punish on her end lag, making it the most blatant example of risk-reward in the game, to the point where there are many situations where landing Rest and getting the stock can guarantee a loss. This is what I mean when I say she's a complete character. If any of the 4 aspects, back air, jumps, rest, crouch under grab were removed, Jigglypuff would likely not even be top 8. If any of these aspects were added to another character, that character would probably become best in the game. The problem with Jigglypuff is that she is disproportionately good against a lot of the top 8, especially Peach, making it that a lot of the top players feel the need to have a pocket fox in order to counter her, or else learn a matchup that no one has yet solved. Peach can be defined as a brick wall. She has slow movement speed that is made up for huge powerful hitboxes and a lot of options to deal with aggression. If she ends up winning neutral, she can cover multiple options with her float and land very consistent edge guards in a way that often makes it feel like the best thing to do is to put down the controller when you grab. Her turnips are also very useful in stifling approaches and covering options as well, with the fact that she has a random chance of pulling out bomb-oms, a beam sword, or a turnip that has a ludicrous amount of knockback called a stitch face seems like an option I wish could have been removed. With that said, there is nothing inherently broken about her, and the fact that the current undisputed champion is a Peach player proves the dominance of Fox is a relative myth. Despite Fox being probably the best character in the game, the top 8 meta is relatively balanced, to the point where one player can consistently beat all the best Foxes in the world. Sheik is the #1 reason in the game why the top 8 is the top 8, more so even than Fox. This is because pretty much anyone under the top 8 loses hard to Sheik due to her down throw, which is either a chain grab or a very easy tech chase into edgeguard. The most lopsided matchup in the game is very likely Sheik versus Bowser, and this is mostly due to the fact that a single grab guarantees death, and there's nothing Bowser can begin to do to avoid that grab. Despite her being a big factor in the lack of character variety, it's safe to say that within the context of the top 8, she's a much more interesting character, since she only has the down throw shenanigans against Captain Falcon, who has been developing ways to deal with it in turn. Her aerials are all multi-use, safe, strong, and fast. She can set up complicated edge guards, and her invincibility and her recovery makes it difficult to edge guard her back. Overall, Sheik is an example of less than perfect design from Sakurai, having less negative repercussions than it honestly should have. Captain Falcon is the best designed character in the game. He has a huge dash dance, is fast, and every one of his moves is incredibly satisfying to land. His explosive combos that require using multiple aerials in creative ways make him a bit of a fan favorite as a stylish character. And in many ways, this has held back the character from a competitive perspective. Many of the top players care a lot about looking cool while they play, and this can often get in the way of the efficiency of the character. He has reaction tech chases on many of the cast, and has one of the best matchups against all floaties in the game, making him a decent choice against Jigglypuff. But many players won't play the patient, efficient way required to have any shot of winning at the top level, and so the character has become in some ways a bit of a joke, as he is often called the worst of the viable characters. When watching top level players, it seems apparent to me that Falcon hasn't yet been pushed as far as he can go, and there may be a lot of new developments that push him into the realm of winning major tournaments yet. Regardless of this, his defensive options can sometimes be quite poor, as he has a very slow standing dodge and his recovery cannot sweet spot, which is a term that means to grab ledge without poking above it at all. If this was fixed, and he gained the ability to grab the ledge with his forward B as well, then I think he would be a perfect character in respect to design and balance. In the future, I hope to see more slow, deliberate, and less stylish Captain Falcon mains showing off the true potential of the character. The final character I want to discuss is the Ice Climbers. The Ice Climbers benefit more than any other top 8 character from wave dashing, as it dramatically increases their ground speed. This is very important to the character since they have a lot of glaring weaknesses. If a player is capable of separating the Ice Climbers, the one who is usually Nana is controlled by an AI, while the player continues to control Popo. The problem is that a fast player is capable of comboing to death the AI without the Ice Climber having any way of stopping it, and Popo alone is a very weak character overall. Mix that with poor air speed and aerials, there's only one thing going for Ice Climbers that keeps them where they are, and that is their grab game. Ice Climbers has the most interesting, creative, complicated grab game in the series. The fact that one climber can throw and the other can re-grab or attack, which can then be comboed into another grab or attack, can set up for some of the coolest option coverage I've ever seen in any game ever. There is only one reason this isn't my favorite character in the game, and that is wobbling. It turns out, despite all the interesting gameplay that comes from a grab, very little of it is relevant since there's a technique in which the Ice Climbers stagger pummel and forward tilt, and this infinites the opponent until death. My problem with this isn't so much a balance issue, though I do think it upsets the metagame of most matchups against Ice Climbers. The problem is that Ice Climbers already has a lot of interesting gameplay off of grab, but unfortunately none of that is optimal when there's a quite simple infinite instead, and that takes away from the beauty of the character's punish game. Currently, wobbling is legal in the rule set for various reasons, and so unless that ever changes, it will remain my least favorite part of competitive Melee. Not how boring watching wobbling is, but rather the fact that one of the coolest characters in the game doesn't have any rational reason to show off what makes them so interesting. In my previous video, I discussed the neutral game to punish game ratio of Smash 64, in which one win of neutral could result in a punish that lasted until death. Melee strikes a much better balance, where if you're an adequately good player and playing the right competitive matchup, an entire stock is gone after about 4 or 5 neutral exchanges on average. There are definitely many 0 to deaths in Melee, but the difference between it and 64 is they were not guaranteed. Since Directional Influence is in the game, once a character is juggling an opponent, the opponent still has many options at their disposal. Due to this, a 0 to death is never guaranteed between any of the top 8 characters in the game, except for the Ice Climbers Infinite of course. Some discussion can be had about reaction tech chasing, but those are just difficult enough that no one has yet to be able to do those with 100% consistently at the top level. In order to explain why there aren't consistent 0 to death combos every stock at the top level, you have to take into account 3 aspects of the game. First is human beings' limited reaction time. Second is the number of options at any one moment the opposition has. Third is the sometimes absurd level of difficulty and execution in competitive Melee. So let's take these 3 aspects one at a time. A good multiplayer game uses its mechanics as a vessel for a struggle that happens between 2 players. While understanding the nuances of how a game works is very important in order to be able to pose a threat to an opponent, it is equally, if not far more important, to be able to play upon a player's expectations and lack of knowledge. The way this is presented in fighting games is the rock, paper, scissors game design I discussed in my previous video. However, the better player would always be whomever knew more tricks with the character, if it wasn't for the fact that there's an unknown element in the game presented through human reaction time. The human reaction time limit is recorded to be 0.25 of a second visually and 0.17 for audio. In a 60 frames per second game, this is 15 and 10 frames respectively. What this means is while my character is in one position and yours is in another, a player must imagine that you are 15 frames in the future of your current position and act upon that, because anything faster than that cannot be reacted to. This is what makes the rock paper scissors of attack, shield, and grab work. A player always has to ask where you're going to be and what you're going to be doing in that unreactable 15 frame future, while also confirming that they were right about the last 15 frames they had guessed upon. This unknown element is very important in competitive games in order to make sure that it's not a simple execution test the way weightlifting and Guitar Hero is. StarCraft and Dota both showcase this through Fog of War. Chess through its own complexity, making it impossible to memorize all possible board states. Tennis and ping pong through reaction time and execution difficulty, being in my opinion very similar to competitive Melee in many ways. Reaction time is the reason every punish does not become a guaranteed 0 to death, because not only does a player have to follow the drift of their opponent, but they also have 15 frames where they do not know which path the opponent chose, and so the player either has to go for a guaranteed reaction that is slower and more than likely less hard of a punish, or they can go for the read, where they can get to move sooner and set up more committal and more than likely stronger punishes, but at the cost of not being sure the path they chose corresponds with the decision the opponent made. For example, as Captain Falcon, if I read that an opponent is going to roll in, I can use the stomp to set up for his most powerful finisher, the knee. However, if I read that and he does not roll in, I lose my opportunity to continue the punish. If instead I wanted to play it safe, I could react to his roll and get a grab, which I might be able to set up into a combo if I play it right, but with less immediate rewards. Every player is different and tends to choose their own ratio of reactions versus reads. These decisions tend to come from the player's philosophy about the importance of risk versus reward. The fact that risk and reward is so intertwined with the game is the reason these sorts of play styles can come to fruition, and is a major factor in the amount of variety in any given match. The second reason I listed why the games isn't constant 0 to deaths at the top level was the amount of options that are at hand at any one moment. The sheer level of situations that a player per moment has to deal with is a huge reason that the people who have been winning the game for the past few years continue to win the game. The player with a greater understanding of their options at all moments can utilize these extra tools to constantly get the upper hand to the point where the 5 best players in the world in their thousands of matches have not lost to a player under the top 100 in many years. To explain what I mean, let us examine a specific situation. Fox wants to approach Peach, and as the faster character, he gets the privilege of initiating the exchange. Fox throws a neutral air at Peach, which Peach reacts to and shields in time. Fox's neutral air is so lagless that after a successful L cancel, he is able to get a shine and continue the combo. At first, it seems unfair that Peach is punished for successfully blocking Fox's attack. But let's take a moment and assume Peach knew the neutral air was coming. If she did, she could crouch the attack, because in Melee, when you are crouching, you eliminate roughly a third of the stun from getting hit, and can prevent yourself from being launched at low percents. This is called crouch canceling. If she successfully crouches the neutral air, she can get a free down smash, which sets up for an edge guard, or combo. But what if the Fox knew that the Peach was going to crouch? Fox's down air, often called the drill, is comprised of tiny hits called meteors, which have a special property where they push an opponent downwards and can't be crouch cancelled. Fox can use this drill to beat crouch cancel and get a free grab or shine. But what if the Peach knew the Fox was going to drill? In Smash 64, there was a property called SDI where you can drift one way or another during hit lag. This is still in Melee, and so since drill is comprised of many small hits, Peach can take the time to SDI each of the hits to the point where she is out of range of Fox grab and can get a free punish. But what if the Fox knew that the Peach was going to try to SDI the drill? While Peach is doing the necessary little stick movements for the SDI, Fox can just jump in to feign the drill, land without an attack, and then grab. You may be able to guess the next couple of steps of counterplay. Peach just has to attack instead of trying to SDI to beat the jump in grab, and Fox can choose to neutral air, which beats out most of Peach's attacks. Competitive Super Smash Bros. Melee is the biggest indicator in the series that Sakurai might secretly be a genius. There are so many little seemingly accidental aspects of the game that could completely break it if it weren't for a completely different seemingly accidental aspect of the game that balances it out. The trade-off for the excess of options that were unintended was that since they weren't designed to be consciously used by people playing the game, they are relatively inaccessible, and players are constantly finding more difficult techniques that drive up the skill ceiling even further, which is why my third reason players aren't constantly 0-to-deathing each other was the execution barrier. Top players have to consistently execute frame-perfect exploits and inputs in order to move around the stage properly and continue their punishes. Since combos get more difficult the higher level your opponent is, the execution can reach a level of APM that is a class above the average fighter. There is a common misconception that because Melee is a kid's game, the competitive techniques themselves are relatively simpler, but since these techniques are unintended, a large number of them are not balanced around a human being able to perform them ever. Many techniques, like the hack stash, consistent pivots, reaction tech chasing, and multi-shines in neutral, are so near the level of impossible that there are many top players that are only able to perform a few, if any of them, even after 15 years of experience with the game. There are many techniques in the game that are simply too fast for any human to be able to do, and so no one can do them, even inconsistently. Every year, players push what a human is thought to be capable of doing further, and every year, more techniques are discovered for which players strive to learn. Take V-canceling, in which a player in the air can press L 3 frames before getting hit, and they take 5% less knockback. No one knows why this is in the game or how it could possibly have been accidentally programmed in. These issues present themselves in a number of odd bugs and competitive fallbacks. For example, the small chance for you to miss a backdash randomly, the simultaneous grab being decided by the higher controller port in the console, or a glitch where vertical momentum is cancelled, called the invisible ceiling glitch. The most contentious technical barrier is L cancelling, since it's so arbitrary and doesn't add an aspect of risk-reward to the game. You just always want to do it. There is debate over whether this is a godsend, however, and that the most fast technical rushdown characters need to have this extra layer of difficulty in order to make playing them difficult enough to hold them back at the lower level, and perhaps this is a fair argument. Overall, I think if it had been removed it wouldn't be the end of the world, but the fact that it is there is fine, since it becomes muscle memory within the first week of competitive play anyways. I tend to view it as a sort of rite of passage, and a combo that includes all the successful L cancels is all the more impressive with them. Difficulty is, in my opinion, vastly underrated in competitive play. This is at risk of sounding elitist, but let me explain what I mean. Sean Plott, also known as Day 9, made a video called StarCraft Remastered Rant that I suggest you watch after this video, that discusses the difference between StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft 2, and how the quality of life improvements didn't make for a better competitive game for him. I think this is another aspect of taking competitive games more seriously rather than considering them a simple pastime. You can use competitive games to pass the time, but there's a natural aspect of competitive games in which better players do better, and people who don't put in time lag behind. If someone viewed these games as more like sports, then it would be okay if Smalls from the Sandlot never becomes Babe Ruth. There's a really famous quote from a BioWare developer: "You press a button and something awesome happens." This is the driving force behind a lot of game design, where the player is presented with the problem that they want all players, both good and bad, to have an enjoyable experience and to feel powerful at the end of the day. While this can be all well and good in its own right, competitive gaming is not the right place for this sort of thing. The fact of the matter is, something awesome is not defined by how cool something looks, but rather how improbable something is to happen. Casual Melee solves this problem through the randomness that is presented through their items. They cause unpredictable chain reactions that affect all the players in an indiscriminate manner. What is awesome as a top-level player is an insurmountable problem, the creativity of the solution, and the difficulty in the implementation of that solution. The inevitable reality of the situation is for something to be difficult to accomplish, there is going to be a hefty percentage of people who are simply not going to be able to do a lot of these things. Because if everyone can do it, how exciting is it really to see? This naturally is going to exclude a lot of people, but in a similar way, many sports exclude people from being able to accomplish the most difficult things, and that's okay, because there's always things that can be accomplished at any level. It's just not going to be everything. Any kid can play catch with his dad and have a good time, the same way anyone can have a good time trying to beat their brother in Melee 1v1s. All that I'm trying to say is that competitive games are better if there is always something new to learn and look forward to. The reason I spent so much time talking about the competitive aspect of Melee is it likely will not ever be remembered for its casual aspects, fun as they are. In most ways, it was eclipsed by its sequels as far as the casual market is concerned. As a competitive game, however, it has been going strong since the day it was released, and very likely it will continue to stay competitive for quite some time. The only thing that could likely kill Melee is a sequel that captures a similar level of complexity and speed, and Sakurai has a very clear stance on the subject. When asked about it, Sakurai said this: "There are 3 Smash Bros. Games out now, but even if I ever had a chance at another one, I doubt we'll ever see one that's as geared towards hardcore gamers as Melee was. Melee fans who play deep into the game without any problems might have trouble understanding this, but Melee was just too difficult." When reading about the development and how Sakurai feels about Melee, sometimes I feel pretty bad for the Melee community, sort of like they are an enthusiastic child with a neglectful father. No matter how much they care for what they enjoy doing, they and Sakurai will never be able to see eye to eye. They are grateful for what they have, but Sakurai will simply never love them back. This hasn't yet put much of a damper on the spirits of those who continue to play the game despite this. Through the implementation of online netplay, Android apps that teach you about the competitive game, browser recreations like Melee Lite, and so on, for better or worse, Melee is likely here to stay for a very long time. It's a game with a lot of jagged edges, and it's very likely that if Sakurai had as much time as he wanted, Melee would have never happened in the first place. It's good that he didn't though, because it's the mistakes, oversights, and cut content that ended up creating what was accidentally one of the greatest games of all time. Sakurai next went to work on a game that is now all but abandoned by his players, Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which will be the subject of my next video.